topic clearly has resonated over the past 45 years, as our illustrious president's decision to use super destroyers as the title for this section demonstrates. Even at the time, I found this booklet simultaneously seductive. Many navies built examples of large, powerful destroyers during this period, and unsatisfying, not least because the thesis revolved around the question of whether these expensive warships were worth the additional cost over their more conventional sisters. Yet only two of the authors bothered to answer it. Furthermore, a cursory reading of Conway's booklet quickly demonstrated that there was no real commonality to the rationales behind each navy's decisions. Even before the German abrogation of the Treaty of Versailles, work began on designing new destroyers well in excess of the 800-ton limit imposed by the treaty. The resulting 16 Type 1934 and Type 1934A boats were much larger than most contemporaries at over 2,200 tons, compared with the British 1,350-ton H-class, for example, and carried 5 12.7-centimeter guns as main armament. The anti-aircraft outfit was 2 twin 37-millimeter weapons and 6 single 20-millimeter guns. And its control largely relied on bouncing off the surface director. The design in most respects was an updated reimagination of the large destroyers Germany had introduced late in World War I. A powerful low-angle main battery, a substantial torpedo outfit, high speed, and a rather short steaming range of barely 1,500 miles. Its two most important innovative features were the power plant, whose boilers operated at 450 degrees C, providing steam at 1,100 psi, well above any contemporary arrangement. In fact, close to twice its closest competitor, and the heavy for the time anti-aircraft outfit. But the anti-aircraft outfit did not have great fire control. In service, the power plant was not always reliable, and the lack of flare and shear forward made the boats very wet in a seaway. The 6 Type 1936 boats that followed represented a modest enlargement. Standard displacement rose to 2,400 tons, and this was largely used to accommodate additional fuel to increase the operational range to 2,000 miles. The final 3 boats were built with flared clipper bows to improve seakeeping. Preston is selected the Type 1936A boats as examples of German super destroyers. Physically, these 17 slightly larger boats displaced just over 2,600 tons, depending on the outfit, and had an increased range of 2,600 miles. The major design change was the installation of 5 15-centimeter guns in a twin turret forward and 3 single mountings aft. Actual armament varied due to production problems and the need for greater anti-aircraft capability. So most landed 1 single 15-centimeter gun to compensate for additional anti-aircraft weapons. Nevertheless, these boats proved to be overloaded and consequently very wet. The rationale for building these large super destroyers was that superior quality would compensate for inferior numbers relative to the Royal Navy. Wartime experience demonstrated the fallacy of this belief. 21 of the 33 boats completed were sunk for negligible returns. I'm going to skip over the porters because Mark has more than dealt with them, except that this is rather a pretty model. And you should note, just as a matter of in passing, it's a card model. Italy and France. Both Italy and France built series of large, heavily armed destroyers designated esploratori by the Italians and contre-torpilleurs by the French during the interwar period. Both navies' initial rationale was that such warships were a cost-effective measure to compensate for a shortage of light cruisers for scouting, especially in the Mediterranean operational environment, that placed a premium on high speed since distances were relatively short and long range was unnecessary. Subsequently, The simple fact that France and Italy were obvious potential enemies drove a necessity for them to compete with each other. Italy built its first exploratore at the end of World War I, the 3 Mirabello-class boats, displacing 1,785 tons, armed with 8 single 102mm guns, and interestingly enough, 2 76mm anti-aircraft guns, reflecting, as I've mentioned previously, the Regia Marina's early commitment to addressing the potential menace of aircraft, especially in the relatively confined waters of the Adriatic and Mediterranean. Their successors, the 3 Leone-class boats, displaced almost 2,200 tons and carried 8 120mm guns in 4 twin mountings. All of these boats were reclassified as destroyers in 1938. Italy's final exploratore were the 12 boats of the Navigatore class. These were similar in size and performance to their precursors, but were armed with 6 120mm guns in 3 twin mountings capable of 45 degrees elevation, giving them some appreciable dual-purpose capability, especially as they had quite effective matching director equipment. They also carried 2 40mm and 2 13.2mm anti-aircraft guns. Like so many of these super destroyers, the Navigatore class proved to be overweight and top-heavy in service, requiring substantial refits to correct the problems. They too were reclassified as destroyers before World War II began and undertook the usual duties of this type. French reaction to the Italian Esploratore was to develop similar large destroyers as counters. Their primary roles were to act as scouts for the battle line and supporting destroyers in pressing home attacks on that of the enemy. 6 boats of the Chacal class were ordered in 1924, displacing 2,100 tons, armed with 5 single 13cm guns and 2 7.6 centimeter anti-aircraft weapons, again without any real control and capable of in excess of 35 knots. Their successors were 3 classes of 6 boats each, collectively known as the 2,400-ton type, although all displaced somewhat more. The main armament caliber was increased to 13.8 centimeters, and each class had a different anti-aircraft outfit. All these 4 classes embarked increasingly sophisticated surface fire control equipment, but their anti-aircraft armament was wholly under local control only. The following 6 La Fantasca class, known as the 2,600-ton class, although they displaced slightly less, represented quite a leap in capability. Main armament remained 5 13.8 centimeter guns on single mountain. Anti-aircraft weapons were 2 single 37 millimeters and 2 twin 13.2 millimeter mountings. The big advance was in fire control. The very sophisticated remote director system incorporated remote control of the main guns that kept them on target even as the vessel moved, and sided anti-aircraft directors, which you can see here on the model. The class was designed for 37 knots, but all easily exceeded 41 knots, while this particular vessel, Le Terrible, attained over 45 knots on trials to set a record for a displacement hull wreck ship that was not broken for 80 years. The final contre-torpilleurs were the 2 Mogador-class boats. They displaced almost 3,000 tons and were designed as expansion of the previous class to act as escorts for the fast battleships Dunkirk and Strasbourg, operating as the force d'arrade in the Atlantic. Their design speed was 39 knots. The main armament was 4 twin 13.8 centimeter turrets. All of these contre-torpedoes were designed unambiguously for effective surface combat, although all had quite heavy anti-aircraft armaments for the period. Only the 8 final boats incorporated the effective fire control necessary to make good use of these weapons. Now we move to Japan. The terms of the Washington Naval Treaty had major ramifications for Japan's grand strategy for war in the Pacific. Previously, it had envisaged a decisive battle well east of the home island between the concentrated Japanese fleet and an American fleet that had made its way there through any attacking forces. Although Japan did not realistically imagine outbuilding the United States, its 8-8 fleet program guaranteed deploying 16 very modern battleships and battle cruisers, backed up by as many as 8 more older but still effective ships, which greatly enhanced the odds in Japan's favor. Washington Treaty appended these calculations, since Japan was limited to 9 battleships or battle cruisers versus 15 American equivalents. The treaty imposed size and total tonnage limits on aircraft carriers and individual tonnage and armament limits on cruisers, but otherwise gave the signatories essentially a free hand for all other types within the category of auxiliaries, which is how Japan viewed all warships other than the battle line. Very rapidly, Japanese strategists developed the ambush attrition strategy, under which light forces of powerful cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, supported by land and sea-based aircraft, would be deployed into the Pacific to whittle down the American fleet as it advanced westward. Central to this strategy was the development of a new powerful destroyer. The resulting special type could well be termed a revolution in destroyer design. Displacement was 30% greater than the previous Mutsuki class at 1,750 tons. This accommodated a 50,000 shaft horsepower power plant, giving a top speed of 38 knots and sufficient fuel for a range of 5,000 miles versus the 3,600 miles of the previous class. Armament too increased. The special type carried 3 twin 12.7 centimeter turrets disposed with 1 forward and 2 aft. Elevation in the first 10 destroyers was 40 degrees, but all later boats carried a new turret design, allowing 75 degrees elevation for anti-aircraft use. Light anti-aircraft armament was limited to 2 single 13mm weapons. Equally important was a heavy torpedo battery of 3 triple 24-inch tubes with 9 additional torpedoes set up for rapid reload. The 24 special type destroyers were followed by 64 later vessels whose design derived from theirs. I will point out that the special type only had low angle fire control, and this applied also to the second group that followed them. But from the third group of modified special class, which actually had to be built slightly smaller than the specials because they were by this time limited by the London Treaty, the Japanese started to fit effective gyro-controlled anti-aircraft fire control. The final group of these types, Kagero and Kagero-class, were armed with 3 twin 12-centimeter turrets with a maximum elevation of 55 degrees, the Japanese having found, like other people, that you didn't really need that much elevation with a medium caliber anti-aircraft weapon. 2 twin 25mm anti-aircraft guns and 2 quadruple 24-inch torpedo tubes with full reloads. The displacement had risen to 2,000 tons because the Japanese pretty much ignored the limitations of treaties. Power output was 52,000 shaft horsepower for 36 knots with a range of 5,000 miles. By the mid-1930s, all these destroyers were fitted with effective surface and anti-aircraft direction systems, which you can see there on the bridge. They also carried the Type 93 24-inch torpedoes that proved deadly in the early stages of the Pacific War. this oxygen-fueled torpedo had an effective range of 24,000 yards at 50 knots, or 44,000 yards at 36 knots, and carried a 1,080-pound warhead. The use of oxygen greatly reduced the exhaust trail of the torpedo, and the reload arrangements, and you can see this on either side. Let me see if I can point it out here. These are reload containers. So what you do to reload is you line up the tubes with this, and then the power ram the torpedoes in. The reload arrangements for these destroyers meant that the tubes could be reloaded within 3 to 5 minutes. Overall, the big Japanese destroyers were arguably the best of their kind in the interwar period.